On an October evening in 1983, in the marbled entrance hall of 778 Park Avenue in New York, Brooke Astor pauses before a small Louis XV writing desk. A reception for one of the city's museums is about to begin. Upstairs, white-gloved staff adjust flowers and crystals. On the desk lies a stack of thick cream stationery and a fountain pen. Before stepping into the cameras and society columns that will call her New York's fairy godmother, she sits to write a few handwritten thank you notes to librarians and janitors she met that week at the New York Public Library. The scratch of the pen, the weight of the paper, the cool light on her triple strand of pearls, all are gestures of refinement and control. Yet as she signs Brooke Russell Astor, her hand rests a moment longer than necessary. The ritual is generous and also a way of keeping order in a life built on other people's money. She rises, folds on her gloves, and walks toward the waiting flashbulbs. The notes will be mailed in the morning. The bill for the evening will arrive much later. In late spring 1902, in the naval quarters at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Roberta Brooke Russell is born into a world of uniforms and ceremony. The daughter of John Henry Russell, Jr., a rising Marine Corps officer, and Mabel Howard Russell, who brings English and Canadian family connections to the marriage. The nursery windows look out on naval yards where ships rise on scaffolding, on parade grounds where bugle calls mark the day's rhythm. The sounds that fill her childhood are not carriage wheels on cobblestones, but the measured steps of military drill, the clang of ship bells, the sharp commands that organize life in garrison towns. Her father's career takes the family on a circuit of imperial postings that will define Brooke's early education in ways no school could replicate. By 1908, she was following him to Peking, China, where Marines guard foreign legations in the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion. The air smells of coal smoke from braziers and the peculiar sweetness of incense from temples. Servants, Chinese household staff, whose names she will later struggle to remember accurately in her memoir, pack and unpack the family's trunks, each wrapped in striped canvas and labeled with destinations that change every few years. Later postings take them to Haiti and the Dominican Republic during the U.S. military occupations of those countries, placing young Brooke at the edges of America's Caribbean empire during the era of gunboat diplomacy and military governance. She observes from the protected space of officers' quarters and diplomatic compounds, close enough to see colonial power in action, but insulated from its consequences by her father's rank and her family's whiteness. In a small notebook that she will later reference in her memoir Patchwork Child, she tapes calling cards collected from diplomatic receptions, draws street scenes from Port-au-Prince and Peking in careful pencil. Records, fragments of conversation overheard at official dinners. The notebook becomes a portable archive of displacement, each page a small attempt to make sense of a childhood spent perpetually arriving and departing, learning to be at home nowhere, and therefore everywhere that American power extends. From an early age, writing little notes becomes both pastime and training, a ritual of politeness that travels more easily than furniture, that can be performed in any posting, regardless of local language or custom. Thank you notes to her father's commanding officers, notes of condolence when fellow officers' families suffer loss, notes acknowledging small kindnesses from the rotating cast of servants and teachers who populate her childhood. The paper and pen are constants in a life of variables, tools for maintaining the appearance of gracious stability, even as everything else shifts. The narrator observes that the empire teaches Brooke Russell that power is ordered, stratified, and always performed under observation. She learns that there are those who command and those who serve, that hierarchy is natural and necessary, that politeness oils the machinery of authority. These lessons, absorbed before she can articulate them, will shape how she understands her own position in later hierarchies of wealth and social status. By 1919, that same careful hand trained in writing thank you notes across 3 continents will sign a marriage contract she does not yet understand, entering an arrangement that will teach her very different lessons about power and its costs. In the autumn of 1919, Brooke, now a striking teenager known for her dark hair and poise, attended Holton Arms School in Washington, D.C., one of the capital's elite schools for young women. The corridors smell of chalk dust and floor wax. Outside the tall windows, the city is transforming from wartime urgency to post-war uncertainty. Motor cars are replacing horse-drawn carriages, hemlines are rising, and the rigid certainties of the Victorian era are giving way to something less defined. School records show her enrollment was brief and somewhat irregular. Her father's continuing military obligations and the family's social commitments in Washington's diplomatic circles create a fragmented educational experience. She attends classes in French and basic literature, learns the rudiments of music appreciation and art history, but the formal curriculum matters less than the informal education she receives in deportment and social performance. The real lessons happen in the school's assembly rooms and at the social events where Holton Arms girls are presented to Washington society. Society columns begin noting Miss Brooke Russell, daughter of Colonel and Mrs. John H. Russell, at embassy teas and afternoon receptions, her name appearing in the careful lists that track eligible young women through the capital's social season. After each invitation, her mother ensures she sits at a small writing desk to compose thank you notes in careful ink, acknowledging the invitation, praising the hostess's arrangements, noting some small detail that demonstrates she was attentive and appreciative. Charm in this context is not optional, but mandatory, a skill to be cultivated as seriously as any academic subject. She learns to enter a room without seeming to push or demand attention, to make conversation that draws others out while revealing little of herself, to laugh at appropriate moments without seeming loud, to listen with an intensity that makes the speaker feel interesting and valued. These are not innate qualities but learned behaviors, practiced in front of mirrors and refined through repeated social performance. The curriculum that matters, unwritten but rigorously enforced, teaches her when to curtsy and to whom, where to sit at formal dinners, never presuming precedence but also never seeming uncertain, how to glide through a room with apparent ease that masks the years of training required to achieve such naturalness. Learning to please becomes a form of homework more demanding than any academic assignment, with consequences that extend far beyond grades. Her mother supervises this education with the same attention to detail that marked her management of households on multiple continents. Every social appearance is reviewed afterward. What was said, to whom, with what effect. Every note is inspected for proper form and appropriate sentiment. The message is clear. Social performance is not frivolity but serious work, and failure has consequences for one's position and prospects. The narrator reflects that before Brooke Russell has any money of her own, before she controls any resources or commands any institutional power, she understands that politeness is a kind of currency, one that women of her class can deploy when other forms of capital remain locked in fathers' bank accounts and husbands' portfolios. The thank you notes, the charming conversation, the gracious demeanor. These are investments in social capital that may eventually be converted into more tangible forms of security and influence. Within months of leaving school, barely finished with her incomplete education, that currency will be spent on a hasty marriage that promises security but delivers something very different. On 26th of April 1919, in Washington, D.C., just after her 17th birthday, Brooke Russell married John Dryden Cuser, in a ceremony that contemporary society columns describe with the usual language of approval. A charming bride, lovely ceremony, well-connected families. Cuser is the son of a wealthy New Jersey family with political connections. His father, also named John, had served as a U.S. Senator and amassed a fortune through investments in Prudential Insurance. The match appears in newspaper accounts to be exactly what such marriages should be: socially appropriate, financially secure, a proper beginning for a young woman from a respectable military family. Behind the closed doors of their home in Bernardsville, New Jersey, a substantial house befitting the Cuser fortune, the reality diverges sharply from the society page narrative. Later court records and biographical accounts describe a marriage marked by John Cuser's alcoholism, his frequent affairs, and episodes of violence that Brooke will reference elliptically in her memoirs and more explicitly in divorce proceedings. One documented incident mentions he broke her jaw while she was pregnant with their son Anthony, an injury that required medical treatment and left physical evidence of abuse that even the elaborate machinery of upper-class privacy could not completely conceal. Yet even during what she will later call the worst years of my life, a phrase preserved in her memoir footprints, the young Mrs. Kuzer continues to write perfect thank you notes to hostesses and political allies, maintains gracious correspondence with family friends, performs the social duties expected of someone in her position. The notes betray nothing of her private circumstances. They are models of appropriate sentiment, correctly formatted, evidence of breeding and training that function as both camouflage for domestic horror and as lifeline to a social world outside the marriage's confines. The performance of normalcy serves multiple purposes. It protects her reputation. A divorced woman, especially one who admits to marital violence, risks social ostracism, maintains access to social networks she will need if the marriage ends, and provides structure and purpose in a life otherwise dominated by her husband's cruelty and unpredictability. The writing desk becomes a kind of refuge, the cream stationery, a portable space of control where she can assert order through gracious phrases, even when everything else feels chaotic and dangerous. In February 1930, after more than a decade of this existence, Brooke filed for divorce in Reno, Nevada, the destination of choice for women seeking relatively quick dissolution of marriages under circumstances that New York and New Jersey courts would scrutinize more closely. The divorce settlement requires her to give up dower rights, her legal claim to a portion of Kuzer's property, in exchange for custody of their son Anthony, then age 9. The choice reflects both the limited options available to divorcing women in 1930 and Brooke's priorities. She will relinquish financial security to maintain maternal authority, accepting economic vulnerability rather than surrendering her child. The narrator observes that elegance, Brooke learns during these years, can be lacquered over cruelty, a beautiful surface that conceals and sometimes enables abuse by making it harder to name or challenge. The same training that taught her to write gracious notes and maintain composure also taught her to minimize her own suffering, to prioritize appearance over reality, to value reputation over safety. 2 years. After escaping this marriage, another marriage will show her what affection and a different kind of financial vulnerability look like inside the drawing rooms of old New York society. On 19th April 1932, in New York City, Brooke marries Charles Henry Marshall, known as Buddy, to friends and family, in a ceremony that draws her into a very different world from the one she has known. Marshall is a well-connected investment banker, descended from James Lennox, the 19th century philanthropist whose private library became one of the founding collections of the New York Public Library. Through this marriage, Brooke enters the intricate network of old New York families for whom cultural institutions matter as much as bank accounts, where trusteeship of museums and libraries carries social weight comparable to membership in exclusive clubs. Their apartment at 1 Gracie Square offers views over the East River, and its interiors are decorated by Ruby Ross Wood, one of New York's most fashionable decorators. Wood arranges Chippendale chairs and thick Turkish rugs, hangs carefully selected paintings, creates rooms that speak the visual language of cultivated taste rather than mere wealth. Brooke, fascinated by this process and eager to develop skills beyond social performance, begins working briefly for Wood herself, and later as a features editor at House and Garden magazine, learning to analyze and articulate the subtle codes of interior design. At House and Garden, she edits articles about period furniture and garden design, interviews decorators and architects, develops an eye for the small details that distinguish authentic taste from pretension. The work provides income, modest but meaningful, and more importantly, gives her expertise and professional identity beyond her roles as wife and mother. She begins to understand that knowledge itself can be a form of capital, that being able to speak authoritatively about 18th century furniture or appropriate paint colors grants access to conversations and circles that would otherwise remain closed. During this marriage, Brooke's ritual of thank you notes evolves. She writes not just to hostesses, but to butlers and housekeepers who have done things so beautifully, to gardeners who maintain the small plots behind townhouses, to the workers whose labor makes elegant entertaining possible, but who usually remain invisible in social accounts. The practice reflects genuine appreciation. She understands from her childhood following her father's postings how much work goes into maintaining appearances, but it also serves strategic purposes, building networks of goodwill that extend beyond her social peers to include the staff who make that social world function. In old New York's overlapping circles of wealth, culture, and philanthropy, Brooke discovers that refinement can be more than armor against cruelty. It can be a craft she actively shapes rather than merely performs. She learns which museum trustees sit where at dinners, whose support matters for which cultural initiatives, how to navigate the complex politics of charitable boards and library committees. This education proves more valuable than her brief formal schooling, providing the knowledge and contacts that will later enable her philanthropic career. The Marshall marriage gives Brooke something the Cuser marriage never offered: affection within a partnership that treats her as a competent adult, rather than as decorative possession or target for violence. Buddy Marshall's respect for her intelligence and increasing expertise in design and cultural matters allows her to develop beyond the merely charming young woman she was trained to be. For the first time, she experiences marriage as something other than either a gilded cage or a violent trap. Yet by the mid-1940s, as World War II strains financial markets, Buddy Marshall's investment firm faces difficulties. The narrator observes that for the first time, manners feel less like armor and more like a craft Brooke can shape and deploy strategically. But that craft still depends on financial stability she does not control, on a husband's fortune that is proving less secure than it once seemed. When Buddy's finances falter, that craft will become not just a social grace, but a survival skill. By the mid-1940s, as World War II disrupts markets and strains the financial firms that service old wealth, Buddy Marshall's investment business encounters serious difficulties. The specific details remain private. Wealthy families guard their financial troubles carefully, but the effects ripple through the Marshall household at Gracie Square. The East River continues its perpetual flow outside their windows, but inside, the atmosphere shifts subtly from ease to calculation, from security to a more precarious kind of balance. Brooke, now in her early 40s with a grown son from her first marriage and stepchildren from Buddy's previous marriage, makes a decision that distinguishes her from many women of her class and generation. She goes to work. First, she assists Ruby Ross Wood, the decorator who had furnished the Gracie Square apartment, helping with client consultations and project management. Then she moved to House and Garden magazine, where she worked as a features editor for approximately 8 years through the late 1940s and early 1950s. Magazine mastheads and design office memos preserved in publishing archives document this period of her life through a different kind of evidence than society columns provide. She is listed among the editorial staff, receives correspondence about articles and deadlines, participates in the professional world of design journalism that operates adjacent to but distinct from her social world. She studies floor plans during office hours, evaluates paint chips and fabric samples, edits copy about period furniture and garden design, then returns home to the apartment overlooking the East River to fulfill her continuing role as Buddy's wife and hostess. The double life requires constant calibration. She hosts small dinners where she is simultaneously attentive wife performing social duties and working woman mentally cataloging room arrangements and table settings for potential editorial use. The thank you notes she writes during this period often mention enchanting rooms and beautifully thought out comfort, phrases that serve double duty as genuine appreciation and as coded language for the economic security she's not entirely certain she still possesses. Contemporary sources describe mid-century New York as a period when many socially prominent women entered the workforce in acceptable taste professions: decorating, fashion, publishing, museum work. These were not primarily careers of necessity, but of choice, ways for educated women to deploy their cultivation and connections in settings that enhanced rather than threatened their social standing. Yet for some, including Brooke, employment also provided practical insurance against financial vulnerability, income streams that did not depend entirely on husband's business success. The experience of working, of receiving paychecks with her own name, of professional recognition for expertise rather than just social performance, shifts something in Brooke's understanding of herself and her position. She discovers that dependence is less frightening when she can sign her own paycheck, that having resources of her own makes the architecture of marriage feel less like a trap and more like a partnership between adults with separate identities and capabilities. The narrator reflects that employment does not undo class or fundamentally change Brooke's social position. She remains Mrs. Charles Marshall, moves in the same circles, and maintains the same social rituals, but it translates her cultivation into expertise, her social knowledge into professional capital, her position into something she has earned rather than merely received through marriage. The transformation is subtle but consequential, giving her confidence and skills that will prove crucial after 1952, when widowhood will suddenly make her both more vulnerable and more visible. In 1952, Buddy Marshall died, leaving Brooke a widow in her early 50s with a grown son and stepchildren who are adults with their own lives. Black crepe replaces the bright silks and pastels of her working wardrobe. Condolence letters accumulate on the same Louis XV writing desk where she has drafted thank you notes for decades. She answers them all, handwriting tiny acknowledgments on cream paper with the black border that signals mourning, each note appropriately somber, yet also gracious, thanking correspondents for their sympathy and kind words about Buddy. As Mrs. Charles H. Marshall, she occupies a position that is respectable but not enormously wealthy. Buddy's financial difficulties in the 1940s, whatever their specific nature, have apparently prevented him from leaving her the kind of fortune that would make her independent in the way that truly rich widows can be. She has her own income from her editorial work, has the Gracie Square apartment and its contents, has the social connections built over 2 decades of marriage into old New York's cultural circles. But she does not have financial security sufficient to maintain her position without attention and effort, yet precisely because she is respectable, cultivated, connected to the right families and institutions, and now unmarried, she becomes more visible in the overlapping worlds of society and philanthropy. She appears more frequently in society pages, photographed at museum benefits, library fundraisers, concert openings, events where cultural institutions seek both financial support and social validation from people like her. The camera sees her triple strand of pearls and her composed smile, the perfectly fitted black dress giving way after appropriate mourning period to more colorful but still elegant attire. The camera does not see the account ledgers in her desk drawer, the careful calculations about what she can afford and what invitations she must accept for strategic reasons rather than pleasure. Society columns from this period describe her as the attractive Mrs. Marshall, note her presence at important cultural events, mention her board positions at various charitable organizations. She is performing a familiar role, the well-connected widow who devotes herself to cultural and charitable causes, but now with an added element of necessity. The performance maintains her social position while also keeping her visible to the networks of wealth and influence where the next phase of her life might be found. Contemporary observers and later biographers suggest that widowhood paradoxically offers Brooke more freedom than she has known in either of her marriages. She is no longer subject to a husband's authority or dependent on his moods and decisions. She can accept or decline invitations based on her own judgment, can cultivate the relationships she finds interesting or useful, can shape her public identity through the causes and institutions she chooses to support. The constraint of limited finances makes these choices strategic rather than purely voluntary, but they remain more genuinely her own choices than the roles assigned to her as daughter, wife, and social performer. The narrator observes that social performance can function as a bridge between one identity and the next, that the skills Brooke has cultivated across 3 decades of marriage and social life now provide the foundation for a transformation she does not yet anticipate. In October 1953, barely a year after Buddy's death, a third marriage would lift her into one of America's most famous fortunes. and tie her fate permanently to a Gilded Age name that carries both enormous prestige and considerable burden. In October 1953, Brooke Marshall married Vincent Astor at his estate in Bar Harbor, Maine, 11 months after Buddy's death. The marriage unites a 51-year-old widow of modest but respectable means with the last great male heir of the American Astor dynasty. A fortune built in the early 19th century on fur trading, real estate, and the systematic acquisition of Manhattan property that has made the Astor name synonymous with wealth and social position for over a century. Vincent Astor's townhouse at 130 East 80th Street and his Hudson River estate, Ferncliff, carry an atmosphere distinctly different from the Gracie Square apartment Brooke has known. Here the furniture is heavier, darker, more obviously old. Portraits of earlier Astors line the walls. John Jacob Astor Viwarn, who built the original fortune, William Backhouse Astor, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor who ruled Gilded Age society. The weight of that history, the expectation that Vincent's wife will somehow measure up to Caroline's legendary social leadership, presses down on every room. Household staff now address her as Mrs. Astor, not Mrs. Vincent Astor, which would distinguish her from earlier bearers of the title, but simply Mrs. Astor, as if the name itself confers identity sufficient to eclipse her previous selves. The assumption is both honoring and erasing, granting her enormous social prestige while simultaneously making her disappear behind the famous name. Society writers begin the inevitable comparisons, assessing whether she possesses Caroline Schermerhorn Astor's commanding presence, her ability to organize society, her certainty about who belongs and who does not. Brooke responds to this pressure the only way she knows, by writing notes. She thanks the Ferncliff gardeners for the roses that appear in her rooms, writes to the librarians at the Astor Library, which will soon merge with the Lenox Library and Tilden Foundation to form the New York Public Library, sends notes to guests thanking them for a delightful luncheon or wonderful conversation. Each note is a small, precise claim to legitimacy, a demonstration that she understands the responsibilities of her position and intends to fulfill them with grace and attention. The marriage itself, coming so soon after Buddy's death and pairing a woman of modest means with one of America's richest men, generates speculation about her motives that she cannot address directly without seeming defensive. Some society observers view the match sympathetically. An accomplished widow, finding companionship and security with a man who needs a gracious hostess. Others are more cynical, seeing calculation and social climbing, a woman using her cultivation to capture a fortune. Brooke's response is to perform her role so impeccably that questions about her worthiness become irrelevant. Vincent himself, by most accounts, is not an easy man. Reserved, sometimes imperious, accustomed to deference from everyone around him. But he apparently recognizes in Brooke something his previous wife lacked: genuine interest in and aptitude for the cultural and philanthropic work that increasingly occupies him as he ages and thinks about legacy. She becomes his partner in these projects, attending meetings about the Astor Library's future, discussing which institutions deserve support, and learning the complex ecosystem of New York's cultural infrastructure. The narrator observes that titles can be inherited. Vincent received his simply by being born John Jacob Astor's great-great-grandson, but legitimacy must be earned through performance, through demonstrating that one understands the responsibilities attached to position and takes them seriously. Brooke's thank you notes, written line by line in her careful hand, become a map of the territory she is claiming, evidence that she grasps what it means to be Mrs. Astor, even if she cannot control how that title will eventually use her. After Vincent Astor's death in February 1959, Brooke inherited not just a substantial personal fortune, but also the presidency of the Vincent Astor Foundation, a charitable organization he established in 1948 to benefit New York City institutions. The foundation's assets, which will eventually distribute more than $195 million before closing in 1997, give her unprecedented power to shape the city's cultural and social landscape according to her own vision and priorities. Board minutes, annual reports, and grant agreements preserved in Foundation archives document the transformation of philanthropy into Brooke's primary work and public identity. She approaches the Foundation's mission with the same attention to detail she once brought to decorating projects and editorial work, insisting on personal oversight of every major grant, refusing to sign checks for institutions she has not personally visited and evaluated. "We go and we see," she tells Foundation staff and board members, establishing a principle that distinguishes Vincent Astor Foundation grants from the more arm's-length philanthropy practiced by many large foundations. "We never give to anything we don't see." The policy reflects both practical wisdom — how else can one assess whether an organization deserves support — and Brooke's personal need to connect institutional work to human faces and specific spaces. The Foundation's funds flow to branch libraries in neighborhoods across the city, to homeless shelters and settlement houses, to park restoration projects and museum exhibitions. She makes a point of visiting every project site, arriving unannounced at branch libraries to see how they actually function, touring homeless shelters to understand their operations, walking through parks to assess whether Foundation-funded improvements are being maintained properly. After each visit, she returns to her Park Avenue apartment to write personal notes, not just to executive directors and board chairs, but to the people whose labor makes institutions work, to a janitor for keeping this place so clean and welcoming, to a children's librarian for the magic you make with books and patience, to a Parks Department worker for making this playground safe and joyful for children. The notes serve multiple purposes. They document her engagement and oversight, creating a paper trail of her attention. They build relationships with staff at every level, ensuring she has eyes and ears inside the institutions the Foundation supports. And they perform a version of graciousness that has become her trademark. The wealthy patroness who sees and values the work of people society usually renders invisible. Contemporary accounts from the 1960s through the 1980s describe her as New York's fairy godmother, the socialite philanthropist who rescued the city's cultural infrastructure during decades of fiscal crisis and urban decline. Profile writers emphasize her personal touch, her insistence on knowing exactly where Foundation money goes and how it is used. The image is largely accurate, but also carefully constructed. Brooke understands that her power depends not just on Vincent's money, but on her reputation for hands-on engagement and personal accountability. Yet the Foundation's work, however admirable, also reflects the limitations and contradictions of private philanthropy as a substitute for adequate public funding. The institutions Brooke supports — libraries, parks, museums, social services — are in crisis partly because New York City can no longer afford to maintain them adequately. Foundation grants provide temporary relief but cannot solve systemic problems of urban disinvestment and declining public resources. Brooke's generous support makes her beloved but also allows the government to continue neglecting its own responsibilities to provide public goods. The narrator reflects that for the first time in her life, Brooke's ritual of writing thank you notes and maintaining gracious correspondence directs power outward, rather than merely reflecting it back to more powerful figures. She is no longer simply the grateful recipient of others' hospitality and favor, carefully acknowledging their generosity. She is now the patron whose recognition matters, whose thank you notes carry weight, because they come from someone who controls significant resources. Yet the same habits of deference and trust that make her so effective at personal philanthropy will eventually leave her dangerously exposed to exploitation from within her own family. By the late 1970s and continuing through the 1980s, Brooke Astor's public identity as New York's First Lady of Philanthropy was firmly established. Newspapers and magazines routinely describe her in these terms, emphasizing her tireless visits to libraries and cultural institutions, her personal engagement with the causes she supports, her ability to attract other wealthy donors to projects by lending them her name and presence. Photographs from this period show her at ribbon cutting, ceremonies, and gala openings, always impeccably dressed in bright suits and her signature pearls, always smiling graciously, always appearing to be exactly where she wants to be. Behind this carefully curated public image lies sophisticated strategy. Brooke distributes Vincent Astor's fortune across a carefully selected portfolio of institutions that collectively shape New York's civic identity and cultural infrastructure. The New York Public Library receives multiple grants for branch renovations and program support. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York Zoological Society, and numerous smaller cultural organizations benefit from foundation generosity. Neighborhood organizations in the South Bronx and Brooklyn receive funds for programs serving low-income children and families. The grant patterns visible in foundation records reveal her priorities: literacy and education, particularly for children, cultural institutions that serve broad publics rather than just elite audiences, neighborhood organizations working directly with populations experiencing poverty. She wants foundation money to be visible in communities, to make tangible differences in people's daily lives, rather than simply supporting prestigious institutions that would survive without her help. At home on Park Avenue, her dinner parties function as informal extensions of her philanthropic work. Guest lists are constructed with strategic attention to who might fund which projects, who needs to meet whom, which museum director should sit beside which foundation president. A carefully chosen seat at Brooke Astor's table can repair a tarnished reputation or launch a new cultural initiative. The thank you notes she writes after these dinners carry implications that go beyond mere courtesy. They are diplomatic communications that reinforce alliances and signal approval or subtle displeasure. She has become, by her 70s and 80s, exactly what society columnists say she is: a fairy godmother figure whose approval and support can transform institutional fortunes. The library's Rose Reading Room bears her name after a major restoration she funded. Parks across the city contain her plaques. Cultural organizations list her prominently on their boards and benefactor rolls. The visibility of her philanthropy creates a virtuous cycle. Her reputation attracts other donors, making projects more successful, which enhances her reputation further. Yet beneath this triumphant public narrative lies a more complicated reality about her personal circumstances and dependencies. She lives in Vincent's apartment, surrounded by furniture and art he collected, managing a foundation he established, spending money he earned. Her own contributions, the social skills, the strategic vision, the personal engagement that makes the philanthropy so effective, are real and valuable, but also ephemeral, harder to document and preserve than financial assets. She is powerful, but only through Vincent's money. Influential but dependent on structures she did not create and cannot control. The narrator observes that Brooke has transformed early experiences of powerlessness inside abusive and financially precarious marriages into a platform for exercising significant influence over New York's cultural life. She uses elegance and gracious performance, tools that once protected her from violence or disguised economic vulnerability, to engineer genuine public good. The evolution is remarkable and worthy of the admiration she receives. Yet her own household arrangements, particularly her financial dependence on her son Anthony and his increasing control over her affairs, quietly replicate the very vulnerabilities she has spent decades learning to manage. Anthony Dryden Marshall, Brooke's only biological child from her first marriage to John Kuser, changed his surname in 1942 to Marshall, adopting the name of his stepfather Buddy Marshall, whom he apparently regarded with more affection than his biological father. By the 1980s, Anthony is not only Brooke's son, but has become her business manager, estate planner, and increasingly, the gatekeeper who controls access to her finances and person. Financial documents and legal records that will later be examined in court proceedings show a complex web of powers of attorney, trust amendments, and codicils executed during Brooke's 80s and 90s. Each document shifts slightly more control to Anthony, giving him authority to manage accounts, approve expenditures, make investment decisions, and ultimately to reshape the disposition of her estate according to priorities that may or may not align with her own wishes. Family letters from this period describe Anthony as a dutiful son, attending to his elderly mother's affairs, taking on burdensome responsibilities to protect her from financial predators and ensure her comfort. This narrative emphasizes his sacrifice and devotion, painting him as the good son who has dedicated himself to caring for a mother who might otherwise be vulnerable to exploitation by the staff, advisors, and hangers-on who surround wealthy elderly women. Yet other accounts, particularly from friends and foundation staff who observe Brooke and Anthony's interactions, suggest a more troubling dynamic. They describe Anthony as controlling, isolating his mother from longtime friends and advisors, making decisions that serve his interests rather than hers, gradually stripping away her autonomy even as he claims to protect her. The contrast between these narratives cannot be resolved from the documentary evidence. Both accounts may contain partial truths, or one may be accurate, and the other a deliberate misrepresentation. What is clear from multiple sources is that Brooke, even in her 80s, continues her habit of writing thank you notes, though now she often dictates them to secretaries rather than writing them herself. The physical act has become difficult. Her hand trembles, her script wanders across the page. The clear penmanship of earlier decades has been replaced by shaky letters that increasingly require secretarial assistance to produce. Yet the ritual persists. After events and visits, notes must be written. Gratitude must be expressed. Relationships must be maintained through the exchange of gracious words on paper. The narrator observes that the same trust that made Brooke's philanthropy so personally engaging and effective, her willingness to rely on people, to believe in their good intentions, to assume that those who claim to care for her actually do, now shapes her most intimate vulnerability. She expects that Anthony will treat her as she has treated the institutions and individuals she's supported, with care, transparency, and respect for her autonomy and wishes. The expectation seems reasonable. What mother would not trust her only son, particularly one who has spent decades apparently devoted to her welfare? But it may prove costly if that trust is misplaced. By 2000, Brooke Astor had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a degenerative condition that progressively erodes memory, judgment, and eventually the ability to recognize family members and familiar places. She is in her late 90s, having lived far longer than most people of her generation, and her public appearances have become rare. Society columns still mention her occasionally, invoking her philanthropic legacy and expressing hope for her health, but the woman who once dominated New York's cultural scene has largely withdrawn from public view. Inside the Park Avenue apartment, however, conditions are deteriorating in ways that become visible only gradually to the small circle of people with access to Brooke. Nurses hired to care for her report troubling observations to friends and eventually to authorities. Her medical care seems inadequate given her wealth, with routine doctor visits delayed or skipped. Her personal grooming has declined sharply, with cheap drugstore makeup replacing the expensive cosmetics she previously used. Her beloved dachshunds are kept away from her because Anthony worries they might scratch the valuable antique furniture. Friends who manage to visit against Anthony's increasing restrictions report that Brooke's clothing is worn and shabby, that she appears uncomfortable or cold, that the apartment's famous art collection seems to be disappearing piece by piece. These observations filter through social networks, generating concern and eventually prompting action from her grandson, Philip Marshall, Anthony's son from his first marriage, who has maintained a relationship with his grandmother separate from his increasingly strained connection with his father. In July 2006, Philip Marshall filed for guardianship of his grandmother in Manhattan Surrogates Court, submitting affidavits that allege elder abuse and financial exploitation by Anthony Marshall and his wife, Charlene. The petition details declining care, quality suspected forgery of Brooke's signature on legal documents, substantial sums transferred from her accounts to Anthony's benefit, and a pattern of isolation that has cut her off from longtime friends and advisors who might question these arrangements. Legal filings and media coverage of the guardianship proceeding describe altered wills and codicils that substantially increase Anthony's inheritance at the expense of charitable bequests Brooke had previously designated. Millions of dollars appear to have been redirected toward Anthony's benefit, money that had been earmarked for the New York Public Library, Metropolitan Museum of Art, and other institutions Brooke had spent decades supporting. Anthony denies any criminal wrongdoing, maintaining that he has acted appropriately to manage his mother's affairs and protect her interests, The court ultimately removes Anthony from control of Brooke's finances and person, appointing Annette de la Renta, widow of designer Oscar de la Renta and a longtime friend of Brooke's, as guardian. The intervention comes late. Brooke is nearly 104, deeply impaired by Alzheimer's, unlikely to recover the capacity to understand or address what has happened to her finances and autonomy. On her bedside table at this point, according to reports from caregivers and visitors, piles of unanswered letters accumulate. The woman whose life was organized around the ritual of correspondence, who wrote thousands of thank you notes across 8 decades, is now shielded from her own mail by caregivers worried that seeing letters she cannot answer will distress her. The ritual that defined her public identity, gracious, attentive, personally engaged, has become impossible for her to perform. The narrator observes that elegance and cultivation cannot defend against neglect and exploitation when the threat comes from within the family circle that social convention assumes is safe and loving. The same deference to family loyalty, the same assumption that children naturally care for elderly parents' well-being, the same habits of trust that served Brooke well in her philanthropic work leave her vulnerable to someone who has legal authority and physical access, but may not have her best interests at heart. When she died in August 2007, the struggle over her legacy was only beginning. On 13 August 2007, Brooke Russell Astor died at age 105 at Holly Hill, her estate in Briarcliff Manor, New York, after years of declining health and the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Tributes immediately pour in from the institutions that flourished under her patronage. The New York Public Library issues a statement praising her transformative generosity. The Metropolitan Museum of Art recalls her decades of board service. Parks and cultural organizations across the city memorialize her impact on New York's civic life. Obituaries in major newspapers emphasize her philanthropic legacy, describing her as the city's fairy godmother and the last of the Great Society hostesses who used her position to benefit the public good. The accounts recall her famous visits to every library branch before approving grants, her handwritten thank you notes to janitors and librarians, her exacting standards and personal engagement. The image presented is of a woman who used inherited wealth wisely and generously, who understood that privilege created obligations to the broader community, who made New York a better city through decades of careful, hands-on philanthropy. Yet, even as these tributes appear, the legal proceedings initiated by Philip Marshall's guardianship petition are continuing. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office has opened a criminal investigation into Anthony Marshall's handling of his mother's affairs, examining financial records, interviewing caregivers and advisors, building a case that will eventually lead to prosecution. The same newspapers that publish glowing obituaries also run stories about the ongoing investigation, creating a complicated narrative where Brooke is simultaneously celebrated philanthropist and elderly abuse victim. 2 years after her death, on 8 October 2009, a New York jury found Anthony Marshall guilty on 14 of 16 counts, including grand larceny, conspiracy, and falsifying business records related to his handling of Brooke's finances and will. The trial, which has drawn intense media coverage, reveals that Anthony and his lawyer, Francis Morrissey, systematically exploited Brooke's diminishing capacity to alter her will and estate plans, redirecting tens of millions of dollars from charitable bequests to Anthony's benefit. Legal scholars and elder care advocates cite the Astor case as a watershed moment in public understanding of elder abuse in wealthy families. The case demonstrates that financial exploitation happens at all economic levels, that family members are often the perpetrators, that even sophisticated wealthy individuals with excellent legal and financial advice can become victims when age and illness compromise their judgment. New York subsequently strengthens its laws regarding powers of attorney and elder abuse, citing the Astor case as evidence of the need for better protections. In court proceedings, expert witnesses analyze photocopies of Brooke's signature on contested documents. The progression is visible in the exhibits. Signatures from her 70s and 80s are firm and consistent, clearly her own hand. Signatures from her 90s show increasing tremor and inconsistency. Signatures on the contested codicils appear shaky, uneven, possibly traced or forged. The line that once carried grace across thousands of thank you notes has become a contested object, examined under magnification, compared across decades, deployed as evidence in criminal proceedings. The narrator reflects that Brooke Astor's story becomes a cautionary tale, a demonstration that even the most polished, privileged, protected life can end in a battle over control framed in the language of family concern and filial duty. The grace and refinement she cultivated across 8 decades, the networks of respect and admiration she built through decades of generous giving, could not protect her when the threat came from someone with legal authority and physical access who knew exactly how to exploit the gaps in the systems designed to protect vulnerable elderly people. Yet even as the criminal trial concludes and Anthony Marshall begins serving his sentence, later reduced and eventually leading to his release, another kind of legacy continues in the city's libraries, parks, and cultural institutions. In April 2012, Sotheby's New York conducted a major auction of furniture, paintings, decorative objects, and jewelry from Brooke Astor's Park Avenue apartment and Holly Hill estate, raising millions of dollars that, in accordance with her revised estate plans, will benefit the charitable institutions she supported during her lifetime. The auction catalog, several hundred pages long, functions as a material biography, each lot photographed and described, each object connected to a moment in her life or a room in her home. Catalogs document her triple strand of pearls, estimated at tens of thousands of dollars, Chippendale chairs from the Park Avenue dining room, paintings collected during her marriage to Vincent Astor, a sofa famously chewed by her beloved dachshunds, the wear visible in photographs, described in the catalog with amused affection as evidence of a woman who valued her dogs over pristine furniture. Each lot description is a miniature story, connecting objects to anecdotes, to her reputation, to the life she lived in, and among these things, collectors and museums bid on the contents of her life, dispersing them across private homes and institutional collections where they will exist separately, stripped of the context that made them meaningful. The pearls she wore to thousands of events, the desk where she wrote her famous thank you notes, the chairs where dinner guests sat while she orchestrated conversations and connections, all become isolated objects again, their connections to her life and work preserved only in catalog descriptions and subsequent provenance records. Meanwhile, across New York, the institutions she supported continue their work. At the New York Public Library, plaques and endowment records bear her name. The Rose Reading Room, which she funded restoration for, welcomes thousands of readers and researchers who may or may not know about her role in preserving this great civic space. Neighborhood branch libraries she visited and supported continue serving communities, many in buildings she helped renovate or programs she helped fund. The city's parks, museums, and cultural centers still benefit from grants she approved and funded decades earlier. In a 1997 New Yorker profile published a decade before her death, Brooke expressed ambivalence about her own public image, telling the reporter that she worried she had become a sort of monument in the public imagination. She added that running the Vincent Astor Foundation kept me within bounds, suggesting that the discipline of systematic philanthropy provided structure and purpose that pure socializing might not have offered. That being accountable for spending someone else's money forced a rigor and engagement she might otherwise have lacked. On a quiet weekday afternoon in one of the branch libraries she once visited, a librarian at the circulation desk straightens a display of children's books and notices a small framed note that someone has hung on the staff break room wall. A brief thank you from Mrs. Astor, written on cream paper now yellowed with age, thanking library staff for making this place a refuge and a resource for this neighborhood. The handwriting is careful but not elaborate, the sentiment expressed in a few gracious sentences. The signature, Brooke Russell Astor, clearly legible despite the years since it was written. The narrator observes that the architecture of privilege that shaped Brooke's life, first constraining her as daughter and wife, later empowering her as philanthropist and patron, gave her unusual tools, the ability to redistribute enormous wealth, to insist that public spaces should be beautiful and welcoming, to see and acknowledge the labor of people society usually renders invisible. But that same architecture also disguised her dependencies and vulnerabilities until they became dangerous, made her trust structures of family authority that failed to protect her, and finally reduced her to an object fought over in court proceedings that she could no longer comprehend. The question her life poses is not whether grace and refinement are admirable. Clearly, they can produce genuine good, but what they cost to maintain and who ultimately pays when their polished surface finally cracks to reveal the fragile human beneath. The documentary's final image is deliberately simple and quiet. In a climate-controlled archive, whether at the New York Public Library, the New York Historical Society, or another institution that preserves New York history, a conservator wearing white cotton gloves opens a gray archival box labeled Astor Brooke Russell Correspondence. Inside are rows of envelopes, some still sealed, others opened and refolded. Beneath the envelopes are stacks of her thick cream note paper, each sheet bearing the letterhead she used during different periods. Mrs. Charles H. Marshall from her second marriage, Mrs. Vincent Astor from her third, simply Brooke Astor from her later years. The conservator carefully lifts a letter from the 1970s, one of the thousands of thank you notes Brooke wrote to library staff, museum workers, and park employees over decades of philanthropic work. The paper is heavy, expensive, the kind of stationery that announces quality before a word is read. The handwriting is Brooke's characteristic script, clear, controlled, the letters carefully formed, the signature, Brooke Russell Astor, executed with the flourish she practiced since girlhood when her mother made her write thank you notes after every social event. Next to the correspondence box, other boxes contain different kinds of documents. Grant agreements bearing her signature as foundation president, board minutes from cultural institutions where she served as trustee, legal documents from the guardianship and criminal proceedings, photographs showing her at library openings and museum galas, her hand often resting lightly on a child's shoulder or holding a pair of white gloves, her pearls always catching the light perfectly. The gloves themselves, if they survived, are stored elsewhere. Textile collections require different environmental controls than paper. The paper and ink, the tools that allowed Brooke to construct and maintain her public identity, to exercise power through gracious correspondence, to acknowledge the invisible labor that made elegant spaces possible, now sit motionless, cataloged and numbered, available for researchers who sign forms and promise to handle them carefully. Brooke helped to polish and preserve moves on above ground. Millions of people use the libraries, parks, and cultural institutions she supported without knowing her name or the role she played in saving these spaces during decades when the city itself could not afford to maintain them. The buildings and programs continue, the physical legacy of her philanthropy more durable than the social position or personal grace that once seemed so central to her identity. In the quiet of the archive's climate-controlled stacks, her thank you notes outlive the fortunes that funded them, the marriages that positioned her to deploy those fortunes, and the legal battles that marked her final years. They remain as evidence of a life spent performing grace, as tools she used to construct influence in a world that gave women few other avenues to power, and as artifacts raising questions that the archive itself cannot answer. When does gracious attention to others represent genuine care versus performance of expected roles? How much of her kindness was authentic generosity versus strategic relationship management? Where is the line between using privilege responsibly and being used by the systems that confer privilege? The conservator carefully returns the letter to its folder, makes a notation in the accession log, and closes the box. The archive preserves but does not judge, documents but does not interpret, maintains the material evidence while leaving to historians and biographers the work of making meaning from what remains. The final question Brooke's life poses, visible in her correspondence, enacted in her philanthropy, betrayed in the abuse that marked her final years, is about the relationship between refinement and power, between the gracious gestures that made her beloved and the dependencies that made her vulnerable. The thank you notes she wrote to janitors and librarians were genuine expressions of attention and appreciation. They were also performances of a class position that both enabled her philanthropy and constrained her personal autonomy. The contradiction cannot be resolved by choosing one interpretation over the other. Both are true simultaneously. She was generous and strategic, caring and calculating, empowered and dependent, a woman who used privilege to benefit others and was ultimately betrayed by the structures of family and trust that privilege assumes will protect its most vulnerable members. In the archive, separated from the flashbulbs and society columns, from the legal battles and media coverage, what remains is simpler. Evidence of a life spent writing notes, signing checks, showing up, paying attention, attempting, within the constraints available to her, to do something useful with circumstances she neither chose nor fully controlled.